A blind man enters a maximum security prison, mocked as weak and helpless. But when the most feared inmate crosses him, he unleashes a deadly skill that leaves everyone questioning. Who is Cale, and what is he truly capable of? Cale's entrance into the prison was unassuming, almost ghostly. He was led through the towering iron gates by two guards, their expressions a mix of indifference and vague unease. His appearance was deceptively frail, short-cropped gray hair, hollow cheeks, and eyes that seemed to stare past everything and everyone. A blindfold loosely draped around his neck only heightened the vulnerability he exuded. He carried a small, tattered bag, the sole possession permitted within these walls. As Cale was escorted to his cell, the sounds of the prison enveloped him, shouts, the clanging of steel, the ceaseless hum of tension that hung in the air. The inmates who lined the walkways peered down like vultures sizing up fresh prey. Cale's calm demeanor drew laughter and jeers. "Hey, old man, you lost," a voice called from above, eliciting a chorus of laughter. "Bet he won't last a week," another chimed in. One figure remained silent amidst the taunts. Martin, a wiry young inmate with sharp eyes and an air of quiet observation. Martin stood apart from the crowd, leaning against a wall. Something about Cale's deliberate movements and the quiet, almost meditative way he carried himself unsettled Martin. While the others saw an easy target, Martin's instincts whispered caution, but he shrugged it off. What threat could a blind man possibly pose in this place? Cale's cell was at the far end of the wing, dimly lit and isolated. The guards shoved him in without ceremony. "Welcome to paradise," one sneered before slamming the door shut. Cale stood still for a moment, letting his fingers brush against the cold steel bars and rough stone walls. His lips moved, barely audible, as if counting or memorizing the dimensions. Then he sat on the cot, his movements smooth and deliberate, folding his hands in his lap as if he had all the time in the world. News of Cale's arrival spread quickly. It didn't take long for Lucas, the self-proclaimed king of the prison, to hear about the blind man in the isolation wing. Lucas was a towering brute with a reputation for crushing anyone who dared challenge him. To him, Cale was a joke, a weakling thrown into his domain for amusement. By the next morning, Lucas and his crew were already planning their first welcoming party. Cale, meanwhile, went about his routine in silence. He moved through the narrow corridors during mealtimes, his cane tapping softly against the ground. The other inmates mocked him, some even shoving him as he passed, but he never reacted. He seemed oblivious to their provocations, his expression serene. Martin observed Cale from afar, his curiosity growing. There was something unsettling about the man's composure, an eerie calm that didn't fit the chaos of their environment. Still, Martin reminded himself not to get involved. This place had taught him one lesson above all: keep your head down, and you might survive. The tension reached its peak one afternoon in the prison yard. Lucas and his gang lounged near the weights, watching Cale as he traced the perimeter of the yard with slow, deliberate steps. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Cale's pale complexion made him stand out even more. Lucas grinned, cracking his knuckles. "This one's gonna be fun," he muttered to his men, who laughed in agreement. Cale, seemingly oblivious to their presence, continued his measured walk. But Martin noticed something no one else seemed to. Cale's posture wasn't that of a man cowering in fear. His steps, though unhurried, were purposeful, as if mapping every inch of the yard. It was a small detail, but it gnawed at Martin, a warning he couldn't quite articulate. For now, the prison waited, unaware that the frail blind man who had just arrived was about to rewrite its rules. The sun blazed over the prison yard as Cale continued his slow, deliberate walk along the perimeter. His cane tapped lightly against the concrete, his head tilted slightly as if he were listening to something only he could hear. From their spot near the weight benches, Lucas and his crew watched with growing amusement. "Look at him," Lucas sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "He's like a little lost lamb." The others laughed, emboldened by Lucas's bravado. One of them, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek, added, "Think he even knows where he is?" Lucas pushed himself up, towering over his companions. "Let's go say hello." Martin, leaning against a wall on the far side of the yard, noticed the group heading toward Cale. His chest tightened. He had seen this play out before. Lucas was a predator, and Cale, at least in the eyes of the prison, was an easy target. Martin told himself not to intervene. It wasn't his fight. But something about the calm way Cale continued to move, seemingly unaware of the danger, made it impossible to look away. "Hey, old man!" Lucas's voice boomed across the yard, drawing the attention of nearby inmates. Conversations hushed as heads turned toward the unfolding scene. Lucas and his crew had a way of turning mundane moments into bloody spectacles. Cale paused mid-step, his cane hovering just above the ground. Slowly, he turned his head toward Lucas's voice. His blank eyes stared past the group, unseeing but eerily focused. "You lost or something?" Lucas smirked, circling around Cale. "This isn't a retirement home, Grandpa." The inmates chuckled, forming a loose ring around the confrontation. Cale remained silent, his expression unchanging. He adjusted his grip on his cane and resumed walking. Lucas wasn't about to be ignored. He stepped in front of Cale, blocking his path. "I'm talking to you, blind boy. Didn't anyone teach you manners?" Cale stopped again, his cane tapping softly against Lucas's boot. The crowd held its breath, waiting for a reaction. Cale's voice, when it finally came, was soft and measured. "Move." The simplicity of the words stunned the group into silence for a moment before Lucas's booming laughter shattered it. "Move?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Or what? You gonna tap me to death with your stick?" Cale remained still, his expression unreadable. Lucas's smirk turned into a scowl. Without warning, he shoved Cale hard, sending him stumbling backward. The inmates erupted in laughter, and even Martin couldn't suppress a wince. Cale caught himself, steadying with his cane. He straightened slowly, his head tilting slightly as if listening to the rhythm of the jeers around him. For the first time, a flicker of something sharp crossed his face, an intensity Martin couldn't quite place. Lucas, emboldened by the reaction, stepped closer. "What's the matter? Cat got your—" Before he could finish, Cale moved. It happened so fast that Martin blinked and almost missed it. Cale's cane lashed out, striking Lucas's shin with pinpoint precision. Lucas yelped and staggered, but Cale wasn't done. In one fluid motion, he twisted the cane upward, catching Lucas's wrist and forcing him to drop the makeshift shiv he had pulled out moments earlier. Gasps echoed around the yard. Cale stepped forward, his movements impossibly quick and deliberate. Within seconds, Lucas was on the ground, his arm twisted painfully behind his back. Cale leaned in close, his voice calm but carrying an edge that silenced the entire yard. "Never touch me again." Cale released Lucas and stepped back, his face once again unreadable. Lucas scrambled to his feet, clutching his arm, his face a mix of fury and humiliation. He stumbled away without a word, his crew following in stunned silence. The yard remained deathly quiet as Cale resumed his walk, his cane tapping softly. Martin's pulse raced. He had never seen anything like it. The blind man wasn't just surviving, he was something else entirely, and everyone in the yard knew it. The events in the yard spread through the prison like wildfire. By the next morning, Cale's name was on everyone's lips. The blind man who had humiliated Lucas, the most feared inmate in the prison, was now a topic of whispered conversations and uneasy speculation. In the dim light of the mess hall, clusters of inmates exchanged theories over their trays of bland food. "I heard he used to be a soldier," one inmate murmured, his voice barely audible over the clatter of trays and muffled conversations. "Some kind of secret agent or assassin." "Bullshit," another retorted, though his tone carried more doubt than confidence. "You really think they tossed someone like that in here with us?" "Doesn't matter what he was. Did you see what he did? Lucas didn't even stand a chance." The conversations trailed off whenever Cale entered the room, his cane tapping softly against the concrete floor. He moved with the same quiet precision, seemingly unaware of the stares that followed him. Most inmates averted their eyes, unwilling to draw his attention. Lucas, however, was seething. From his corner of the mess hall, he glared at Cale with unbridled hatred. His pride had been wounded in the most public way possible, and in a place where respect and fear were currency, he had lost both. His crew sat in tense silence around him, their loyalty shaken by what they had witnessed. Lucas's knuckles whitened as he gripped his tray, the metal creaking under the pressure. Martin watched the scene unfold from his usual spot near the far wall. Cale's calm, almost meditative presence intrigued him more with each passing day. He noticed how Cale seemed to move with a purpose, how his head tilted slightly as if he were listening to the prison itself. There was no fear in him, no hesitation, only an unshakable stillness. After lunch, Lucas retreated to his cell, his mind churning with thoughts of revenge. He couldn't let Cale's actions go unanswered. His reputation demanded retaliation, but this time he would be prepared. No more games. If the blind man wanted to fight, Lucas would bring the war to him. In the dim confines of his cell, Lucas began to gather his resources. He spoke in hushed tones to his remaining allies, some of whom hesitated but ultimately nodded, more out of fear of Lucas than loyalty. The plan was simple: lure Cale into a trap and eliminate him for good. Lucas didn't care about the consequences. His pride had been shattered, and he was willing to risk everything to restore it. Meanwhile, Martin found himself drawn to Cale, though he kept his distance. He noticed how Cale moved through the prison with an almost uncanny awareness, navigating the corridors and common areas as if he could see every crack and corner. Martin couldn't understand it, but he felt compelled to learn more. Still, approaching Cale was easier said than done. The blind man carried an invisible barrier around him, one that kept even the bravest inmates at bay. As the day wore on, the tension in the prison became palpable. Whispers of Lucas's plans reached Martin's ears, and he felt a pang of unease. He had no love for Lucas, but the thought of Cale walking into an ambush didn't sit right with him. Yet Martin hesitated. Intervening meant drawing attention to himself, and attention in this place was rarely a good thing. Cale, as always, seemed unaffected by the undercurrents of danger swirling around him. That evening, he sat cross-legged on his cot, his cane resting against the wall. His face was calm, almost serene, but Martin couldn't shake the feeling that Cale knew exactly what was coming. As lights out approached, the prison settled into its uneasy rhythm. In his cell, Lucas finalized his plan, his grin returning as he imagined the blind man's downfall. Across the hall, Martin stared at the ceiling, torn between staying silent and acting. And in the shadows of his cell, Cale simply waited. The prison, already a place of whispers, was now alive with murmurs about Cale. Yet Cale himself remained a mystery. He never joined the small groups that gathered in the yard or the mess hall. He never reacted to the insults or threats that occasionally floated his way. To Martin, it was as if Cale existed outside the walls of the prison, in a world of his own. Still, Martin's curiosity only grew. He started piecing together fragments of conversations and rumors about Cale. The blind man's movements, so precise, so deliberate, hinted at training that went far beyond ordinary survival skills. Martin had seen men who could fight, but what Cale had done to Lucas wasn't just fighting, it was mastery. One day, Martin mustered the courage to approach Cale. He found him seated in a quiet corner of the yard, his back against the wall, his cane resting across his knees. Cale's head was tilted slightly upward, his face calm but unreadable. "Cale, right?" Martin began hesitantly. Cale didn't respond, but Martin noticed the subtle way his head turned, just enough to acknowledge him. Encouraged, Martin sat down a few feet away, careful not to get too close. He cleared his throat. "What you did to Lucas, that wasn't luck, was it?" Cale's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, though he said nothing. "Look," Martin continued, his voice lowering. "I've been in this place long enough to know when someone's more than they seem. You're different," Cale finally spoke, his voice calm and deliberate. "Why do you care?" Martin faltered. Why did he care? He wasn't sure. Maybe it was admiration, or maybe it was a hope that Cale's strength could somehow offer him a way out of the endless cycle of violence and fear that defined their lives. "You don't belong here," Martin said at last. "I mean, none of us do, but you really don't." Cale turned his head slightly, his sightless eyes meeting Martin's. For a moment, Martin felt as if Cale could see straight through him. "I'm here because I belong here," Cale said simply. Then after a pause, he added, "But maybe not for the reasons you think." The conversation ended there, but it left Martin with more questions than answers. Over the next few days, Martin couldn't shake the feeling that Cale's presence in the prison was no accident. He began to pay closer attention, watching Cale's movements and listening to the whispers of the other inmates. Piece by piece, fragments of Cale's past began to surface, carried on the currents of rumor and speculation. Some said he was a former Special Forces operative, trained in martial arts and counterintelligence. Others claimed he had been a government agent who lost his sight in a botched mission. Still, others believed he had turned rogue, using his skills to eliminate those who crossed him. Cale offered no confirmation or denial, but Martin began to notice the subtle habits that lent credibility to the stories. The way Cale moved through the prison, mapping spaces with his cane and memorizing layouts with precision. The way he listened to conversations, his head tilting slightly as if dissecting every word. Even the way he carried himself, calm, deliberate, and utterly unshaken, spoke of a man who had seen and survived far more than most. Late one night, Cale sat on his cot, his blindfold resting beside him. His fingers traced the worn wood of his cane, his expression distant. For the first time, Martin dared to speak of what he had pieced together. "You were something else before this place, weren't you?" Martin asked softly from the neighboring cell. "Something dangerous." Cale didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that Martin hadn't heard before. "We all have a past," Cale said. "Mine just happens to be written in blood." The silence that followed was heavier than the prison's walls, and Martin knew without a doubt that Cale's story was far from over. The tension in the prison reached a breaking point. Lucas's bruised ego and burning hatred for Cale had festered into a dangerous obsession. Over the days, he methodically rallied his allies, whispering promises of power and revenge. His plans culminated in a single decision. Cale had to be eliminated, and the laundry room, isolated, steamy, and devoid of guards, would be the battleground. Cale, meanwhile, remained his usual silent self, seemingly unaware of the storm brewing around him. Martin, who had overheard snippets of Lucas's plan, wrestled with the decision to warn him. Every instinct screamed to stay out of it, but something about Cale's calm presence made Martin feel an inexplicable sense of loyalty. The laundry room was a damp, claustrophobic space filled with the whirring of machines and the sharp scent of industrial detergent. It was here that Lucas and his men waited, their makeshift weapons hidden beneath piles of linen. The steam from the machines hung thick in the air, cloaking the room in a haze that reduced visibility, a setting Lucas believed would work in his favor. Cale entered the room alone, his cane tapping lightly against the tiled floor. He walked with the same unhurried pace, his head tilting slightly as if he were assessing the space. The door creaked shut behind him, and Lucas stepped out of the shadows, flanked by 5 of his men. Each held a crude weapon, a sharpened toothbrush, a broken pipe, a jagged piece of metal. Well, Lucas sneered, his voice dripping with malice. The blind man finally ran out of places to hide. Cale didn't respond. His cane hovered an inch above the floor as he stood still, his posture relaxed but oddly poised. "Got nothing to say?" Lucas continued, circling Cale like a predator. "Don't worry, you won't need words where you're going." The first strike came from Lucas's right-hand man, a hulking brute who lunged at Cale with a rusted shiv. The movement was fast, but Cale was faster. He sidestepped with a fluidity that seemed impossible for someone blind. His cane snapped upward, striking the attacker's wrist with a crack that sent the shiv clattering to the floor. The room erupted into chaos. The men charged all at once, their weapons flashing in the dim light. But Cale moved like a shadow, his body a blur of calculated precision. Each strike of his cane was deliberate, targeting joints, throats, and pressure points with unerring accuracy. The confined space and thick steam, meant to disorient him, seemed to work against his attackers instead. Martin watched from the doorway, his heart pounding as the scene unfolded. He had followed Cale, unable to suppress his need to intervene if things went south. But now he stood frozen, awestruck by the spectacle before him. Cale wasn't just defending himself, he was dismantling his enemies. Within minutes, the room fell silent except for the groans of the injured. Lucas was the last man standing, his makeshift blade trembling in his hand. He stared at Cale with a mixture of rage and fear. Cale stepped toward him, his cane tapping lightly against the floor. "This is your last chance," Cale said, his voice low and steady. "Walk away." But Lucas, driven by pride and desperation, lunged. Cale moved in an instant, his cane striking Lucas's wrist, sending the blade flying. With a swift motion, Cale swept Lucas's legs out from under him, sending the larger man crashing to the ground. Cale stood over him, his cane poised above Lucas's throat. "Enough," Cale said, his voice carrying an edge of finality. For a moment, Lucas looked as if he might argue, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. He scrambled backward, clutching his wrist, and fled, leaving his men writhing on the floor. Cale turned, his face unreadable, and walked toward the door. As he passed Martin, he paused briefly. "You shouldn't have followed," Cale said quietly. Martin swallowed hard, nodding. But as Cale disappeared into the corridor, Martin knew he had just witnessed something extraordinary. Cale wasn't just a man, he was a force. The laundry room incident sent shockwaves through the prison. By the next morning, every inmate knew the details. Cale, the blind man, had single-handedly taken down Lucas and his crew. The whispers weren't just about his skill. They carried an undertone of awe and fear. Cale's name was no longer spoken casually. Conversations ceased when he entered a room, and the usual jeers and laughter faded into uneasy silence. Even the guards began to take notice. From their watchful perches, they observed Cale with a mix of suspicion and curiosity, whispering among themselves about whether they should intervene before things escalated further. In the yard, the hierarchy of power shifted. Lucas, who had once been the undisputed king, now wandered the edges like a ghost. His crew had fractured, some distancing themselves entirely, while others sought protection from rival groups. His humiliated silence only cemented his fall. No one would follow a man who couldn't protect his throne. Cale, however, seemed unaffected by his newfound status. He maintained his routine, walking the perimeter of the yard, eating alone in the mess hall, and sitting in quiet contemplation in his cell. He didn't command anyone or demand respect, but his presence alone was enough to keep others at bay. Martin observed this shift with growing fascination. He had seen men rise and fall in the prison's brutal social order, but Cale was different. He hadn't sought power or followers. His dominance was effortless, born from something deeper than physical strength. It was as if the prison itself bent around him, reshaping its rules to accommodate his existence. Despite the change in atmosphere, Cale wasn't entirely free from scrutiny. Lucas, though defeated, wasn't finished. Seething with resentment, he retreated into the shadows, nursing his wounds and plotting a final act of revenge. He spoke to anyone who would listen, sowing seeds of distrust and feeding rumors about Cale's mysterious past. Some inmates began to wonder, what kind of man could do what Cale had done? Theories resurfaced: soldier, assassin, spy, and with them came unease. Perhaps Cale wasn't just another inmate. Perhaps he was something far more dangerous. Meanwhile, Martin couldn't shake his growing connection to Cale. The blind man's strength and composure had stirred something in him. A glimmer of hope, a desire to break free from the fear and chaos that defined their lives. Martin began to shadow Cale more openly, his curiosity evolving into a kind of silent respect. One afternoon, as Cale sat in his usual corner of the yard, Martin approached cautiously. He hesitated for a moment, then sat down a few feet away. "You're not like anyone else here," Martin said quietly, his voice barely audible over the distant clamor of the yard. Cale didn't respond immediately. He seemed to be listening to something Martin couldn't hear, his head tilted slightly. Finally, he spoke. "Neither are you," Cale said, his tone matter-of-fact. Martin blinked, caught off guard. "Me? I'm just another number in this place." Cale turned his head slightly, his unseeing eyes unsettling yet strangely perceptive. "If that were true, you wouldn't be here talking to me." Martin fell silent, unsure how to respond. For the first time, he felt as if someone had seen through the layers of fear and bravado he wore like armor. Cale's words lingered, planting a seed of something Martin hadn't felt in years, the possibility of change. As the days passed, the uneasy balance in the prison held. Cale continued to move through its corridors with quiet authority, while Lucas festered in his isolation, plotting a final move to reclaim his pride. The guards watched Cale more closely now, their reports to the warden growing more frequent. Yet Cale seemed unbothered by it all. He carried himself with the same calm detachment, as if he knew the storm brewing around him but refused to be swept away by it. Martin too felt the shift. For the first time since entering the prison, he began to believe that survival might mean more than just enduring. Watching Cale, he started to imagine the faint outlines of a different kind of strength, one born not of fear, but of purpose. Martin's resolve solidified with each passing day. Watching Cale navigate the prison, commanding respect without a single word, Martin knew he needed to act. Fear had been his companion since the day he arrived, but Cale's presence hinted at a way out, not from the prison itself, but from the crippling weight of helplessness. One evening, after the yard had emptied and the prison settled into its usual hum of distant murmurs and clanging gates, Martin approached Cale's cell. The blind man was seated on his cot, his posture as still and composed as always. His head turned slightly as Martin lingered outside the bars. "Kale," Martin began hesitantly, "I need your help." Kale didn't respond immediately, but Martin could sense he was listening. Encouraged, Martin continued, I can't keep living like this, looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next fight. I want to defend myself. To survive." Kale's expression didn't change, but his voice came low and calm. "And why would I help you?" Martin faltered, caught off guard. "Because I'm not like them. I'm not looking for power or revenge. I just want to make it through this place alive." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Kyle nodded, his movements deliberate. "Tomorrow, the yard, be ready." Martin exhaled in relief, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest. As he walked back to his cell, his mind raced with anticipation. Kale's words carried a weight Martin couldn't fully grasp, but one thing was clear: this was a chance. Kale remained seated, his expression unreadable. But for the first time, Martin's desperation had cracked through the wall of silence Kale had built around himself. Lucas's defeat in the laundry room had left him humiliated, but it had not broken his resolve. If anything, it had deepened his hatred for Kale. For weeks, he had brooded in silence, letting his anger fester into something sharper, a plan to destroy the man who had stripped him of his power. He began by whispering seeds of doubt among the other inmates. He painted Kale as a threat, a cold-blooded killer who was using his skills to manipulate the prison for his own gain. "You think he's some kind of hero?" Lucas sneered during one of his secret conversations. "He's playing all of you. He doesn't belong here. He's worse than any of us." For some, Lucas's words resonated. The mysterious air surrounding Kale, coupled with his unmatched abilities, made him an easy target for suspicion. Rumors spread like wildfire that Kale was an assassin sent to eliminate someone inside the prison, that he had struck a deal with the guards, or worse, that he was untouchable because of connections beyond these walls. Lucas didn't stop there. He sought out a guard with a reputation for corruption, Officer Braxton. Over a private conversation in a dimly lit corner of the facility, Lucas made his pitch. "I can give you what you want," Lucas promised, his voice low. "Just give me a window. I'll handle the rest." Braxton, motivated by a mix of greed and disdain for the inmates, agreed to turn a blind eye during the confrontation Lucas was planning. It was a calculated risk, but Lucas knew he couldn't pull this off without some level of inside cooperation. Within days, Lucas had rallied a group of inmates to his side. Most were opportunists, eager to align with whoever promised them protection or power. Armed with shivs and makeshift weapons, they prepared to ambush Kyle during the next yard session. Lucas envisioned the scene vividly. Kale on his knees, bloodied and broken, his aura of invincibility shattered for all to see. But Kale wasn't oblivious. He moved through the prison with his usual calm, but the subtle shifts in the air, the whispers that quieted when he approached, told him all he needed to know. A storm was coming, and Kale was already preparing to face it. The tension in the prison was palpable as the day of Lucas's ambush arrived. Inmates shuffled nervously, avoiding eye contact, their usual bravado replaced with quiet anticipation. Everyone knew something was about to happen, but no one dared speak of it openly. Kale walked into the yard at his usual time, his cane tapping softly against the cracked concrete. The air was heavy with an unspoken sense of foreboding. He could feel it, the subtle shifts in the space, the faint scraping of footsteps that didn't belong. His senses, honed to a razor's edge, painted the scene with precision. Lucas and his men emerged from the far side of the yard, weapons concealed but ready. They spread out, encircling Kale with practiced ease. Lucas's face was a mask of fury and triumph, his pride hinging on this moment. The yard fell silent. Even the guards, posted high above, seemed hesitant to intervene. Braxton stood at his station, feigning disinterest, though his gaze flicked nervously between Lucas and Kale. "Finally," Lucas growled, his voice cutting through the tension. "Time to put the blind man in his place." Kale remained still, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to something distant. His cane rested lightly in his hand, an unassuming weapon in a sea of makeshift blades. "You've made a mistake," Kale said, his tone calm but carrying an undercurrent of finality. Lucas smirked. "The only mistake I made was letting you breathe this long." With a roar, Lucas charged, his men following close behind. The chaos erupted in an instant, but Kale moved like water, fluid, precise, untouchable. His cane lashed out, striking with pinpoint accuracy, disarming one attacker and sending another sprawling with a well-placed blow to the knee. The yard became a battlefield. Lucas's men fell one by one, their weapons clattering uselessly to the ground. Cale's movements were impossibly quick, each strike calculated to neutralize without hesitation. Finally, it was just Lucas. He lunged wildly, his blade slashing through the air, but Cale sidestepped with ease. In a swift motion, Cale struck Lucas's wrist, disarming him, then swept his legs out from under him. Lucas hit the ground hard, gasping for breath. Cale stood over him, his cane pressed lightly against Lucas's throat. The yard was silent except for Lucas's ragged breathing. "Enough," Cale said, his voice low but commanding. Lucas's eyes burned with hatred, but he nodded, defeated. Cale stepped back, letting him scramble away, his authority shattered. Cale turned, his composure unbroken, and walked away as the prison watched in stunned silence. The legend of the blind man had been cemented. The yard remained silent long after the duel ended, its air heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. Cale's victory over Lucas was absolute, not just in force, but in the symbolism of it. He hadn't just defeated a man, he had dismantled the power structure that had ruled the prison for years. The blind man who had entered unnoticed now loomed larger than life. In the days that followed, Cale became a legend. His name was whispered with reverence and fear. Inmates who had once mocked or dismissed him now kept their distance, their gazes averted when he passed. Even the guards approached him with caution, their usual threats and insults replaced by uneasy silence. Lucas, meanwhile, was a shadow of his former self. Stripped of his authority, he wandered the edges of the prison, avoided by the very men who had once followed him. His attempt to reclaim power had only deepened his humiliation. No one dared to challenge Cale now. To do so would be to invite ruin. Martin, however, saw Cale differently. He didn't see a conqueror or a monster. He saw a man who had survived unimaginable odds, who had forged himself into something extraordinary through sheer will and discipline. Martin couldn't help but feel drawn to him, not out of fear, but out of respect and hope. One evening, as the prison settled into its usual rhythms, Martin approached Cale in the dimly lit corridor outside their cells. Cale sat cross-legged on his cot, his cane resting beside him. "Cale," Martin began hesitantly, "I just wanted to say thank you for teaching me, for showing me that I don't have to be afraid." Cale tilted his head slightly, listening. "Fear is a choice," he said after a moment, "but so is strength." Martin nodded, the words sinking deep into him. He hesitated before asking the question that had been gnawing at him. "Why are you here? Someone like you don't belong in a place like this." Cale's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. For a long moment, he said nothing, as if weighing how much to reveal. "Everyone here has a past," Cale said finally. "Mine is no different, but this place, it's not about punishment. It's about what comes next." Martin frowned, unsure of what he meant, but Cale offered no further explanation. The next morning, a letter arrived for Cale. Delivered by a guard with an unreadable expression, it was a rare occurrence in a place where contact with the outside world was a privilege few enjoyed. The envelope was plain, unmarked save for Cale's name written in precise, clean handwriting. Cale opened it in the privacy of his cell. The note inside was brief, written in the same neat script. "The time is near. Be ready." Cale's fingers lingered on the paper for a moment before folding it neatly and tucking it into his pocket. His expression remained calm, but there was a spark of something in his eyes, a flicker of purpose. Martin noticed the subtle change in Cale that day. His movements were as precise as ever, but there was an urgency to them now, a sense that he was preparing for something. Martin wanted to ask, but he knew better than to press. Over the following weeks, Cale's influence on Martin grew. The younger man began to walk with more confidence, his fear replaced by a quiet determination. Under Cale's guidance, Martin learned to navigate the prison's treacherous landscape with a mix of caution and resolve. He wasn't the same man who had once cowered in the shadows. The prison itself seemed to shift around them. With Lucas dethroned and Cale's presence looming over everything, the violence and chaos that had once defined daily life subsided. The guards, though still harsh, seemed less inclined to provoke unnecessary confrontations. The inmates, for the most part, kept their heads down, wary of upsetting the delicate balance Kale's presence had created. But Kale knew it wouldn't last. He could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface, the inevitable storm waiting to break. The letter had confirmed what he had already suspected. His time in the prison was drawing to a close. What waited for him beyond these walls was unclear, but he would face it the same way he faced everything, with calm precision. One night, as Martin sat in his cell, he glanced across the corridor at Kale. The blind man seemed almost otherworldly in the dim light, his stillness exuding an aura of quiet power. Martin found himself speaking without thinking. "Will you ever tell me why you're really here?" Kale didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle. "Maybe one day, but not yet." Martin nodded, accepting the answer. He didn't need to know everything. What mattered was that Kale had shown him something he hadn't thought possible in this place, a way to endure, to survive, and perhaps, one day, to escape. As the prison settled into silence that night, Kale sat alone in his cell, the note burning in his pocket. He closed his eyes, his fingers tracing the wood of his cane, and waited for whatever was to come. And thus, the legend of Kale began to extend beyond the prison walls, a story whispered in shadows and carried on the breath of those who had witnessed his quiet strength. The story of Kale teaches us that true strength doesn't come from physical power or dominance, but from resilience, discipline, and the ability to turn one's greatest challenges into unique advantages. In a world designed to break him, Kale not only survived, he thrived, proving that fear and respect are earned through actions, not words. But it also raises a powerful question. What would you have done in Kale's position? Would you fight, adapt, or crumble under the weight of impossible odds? Click the video on your screen to continue this journey of self-discovery and explore what it truly means to harness inner strength in the face of adversity. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join us as we unravel more stories that inspire and challenge the way we see ourselves in the world. See you in the next video.